but this particular locomotive, they built 25 of these. Firm named Alco in the States built them in the early 40s, and they were built primarily for one short section of track, 75-mile run over the Wasatch Mountains. And apparently this particular line carried a lot of coal and iron ore, and I don't know quite why, but they always had to have 2 engines originally. Why they couldn't simply pull half the number of trucks and had 1 engine, I don't know. But anyway, the loads that they were carrying, they were having 2 engines, and for that reason, to economise and everything, Union Pacific said they wanted a particularly powerful engine. They laid on the specifications, and just to give you an idea of them, the cylinders were 23.5-inch diameter with a 32-inch stroke, driving wheels, 68-inch wheel, and the working pressure on the boiler was 300 pounds. The weight of the engine was over 770,000 pounds, and the tender carried 29,000 gallons of water and 56,000 pounds of coal. So the tender alone weighed 436,000 pounds, which gave a total operating weight of a locomotive and tender of over 1,200,000 pounds. So you can see it was quite a locomotive. The model, as Mike's just said, when you're building anything with wheels on it, obviously wheels are the scale you're tied to. But they worked out very nice because the main wheels on the real thing are 68-inch, which on my mathematics is just over 5'6". So 5.5-inch wheels worked out quite nicely. The driving wheels, as you can see, are built from 5.5-inch circular girders with a flange on the back, which is made up of 8 of the curved strips, which I think make rather a nice flange because they are very roughly to scale. This is a thing which very often with model locomotives tends to spoil them. Flanges tend to be a bit too big. The 12 spokes were a bit of a problem because there's only 8 holes in the girder. So by the time I'd made about 5 of these and taken them to pieces again, I eventually resolved it by using 2 5.5-inch slotted strips and 1 2-inch slotted strip, which were bent to go around inside the girder, between the girder and the flanges at the back. And by doing it that way, I managed to anchor 8 of the spokes in each wheel. So 4 of them were actually floating, but certainly 8 was enough to secure it all right. Counterbalance weights made up with the 4-inch curved strips. The front bogey, that came out roughly at 3 inches, which was a bit of a problem to try and get a wheel with the same depth as the main driving wheel. So what I did there, I used 2 3-inch pulleys together to give a bit more width in the wheel. The drive of the entire thing is a mains motor inside the main unit there, driving via helical gears onto 3 of the axles on each of the units, and then onto the front pulley by a driving band, which gives near enough the correct ratio of wheel rotation against the main driving wheels to get the same speed. The 2 units, 2 power units, obviously had to be articulated somewhere, and right in the middle, behind those cylinders, is the main pivot. There is a pivot bolt with a tongue and groove joint. So when they go around the corner, the entire front unit goes around the corner, But the boiler just carries on straight initially for a while because the boiler is one complete unit right the way through. That gave a bit of a problem to the Union Pacific engineers because they then found out that they were getting a bit tight on some of their curves, the traffic coming in the opposite direction. There's a very interesting book there, and it gives some of their measurements. And they got on one particular curve down to a 3/8 of an inch clearance, which I think is going a bit fine. There again, the engine was not designed to travel very quick, so there wasn't much fear of meeting something the other way, and the wind resistance blowing it much. I don't know if you had a blower engine of this size. But they were designed to travel actually at about 30 miles an hour. But according to the book, which I'm surprised they've gone into print on, but it was known as well that several of the drivers have driven these at 80 miles an hour. I say they drive beautifully, actually. But with all that overhang at the front, I don't think I'd like to go around corners at 80 miles an hour. Anyway, there you are.
Was there any mention about how they stopped them from that speed?
No, now I can actually tell you a funny story about starting and stopping them, because apparently there was quite a technique. Because this model went on show at Henley last year for the first time, and believe it or not, one of the very first people in was an American. And he walked in and said, "Ah, gee, a big boy. I used to work on them." I thought, all my luck. Because immediately he said, well, they weren't like that, and they weren't like that. You know. But anyway, we had a very friendly discussion. And he said, starting these things up, they had such a long train, and there were no buffers on any of their trucks, and all the tension was in the actual book itself. So they had to open up the regulator and start off very, very gently, literally taking each wagon at a time. So I said, by the time you got the poor little bloke in the caboose at the back, the engine had travelled quite a considerable distance, and was probably by that time going at a fair old speed. And he said, if you weren't careful, you left the bloke with the regulator. And he said, similarly, having trotted gaily along the 75 miles of track, you came to slow it down at the other end. And in the same way, you had to literally slow it down truck by truck. Otherwise, you had the bloke in the little red caboose sitting on the corner. Apparently, they were quite a locomotive. Anyway, that's rather going on. But the wheels of the trailing bogie and of the tender are quite interesting. I'll just mention them because they are made up with this new 3.5-inch circular girder, which MW models have manufactured, which of course is very nice because it is literally the same tread on it as on the main girder, so the wheel and everything, that's in proportion. And the backing to it is the disc plate of the ball bearing. And they slot in absolutely together. They just literally lock together, and they make a very nice wheel, again with a small flange. So it does make quite a nice wheel. The first two axles on the tender make up the bogie. That's just a swinging bogie. It's not a power bogie or anything. And the remaining 10 wheels are all rigid to the tender. The springing on the tender is separate on every axle. But the springing on the main locomotive is quite a complicated thing. There's a spring on each of the axles, and it is anchored at the front and at the rear. And between each of the wheels then, there is just a cantilever arm. So that if one wheel goes up, it moves the cantilever and can alter the adjoining wheels accordingly. But on top of that, in case it is a very rough track, a very bad track, not only does that pivot, but it also slides up and down as well. So you can lift the two centre wheels clean up. And it does all work on the model, but I must admit the axles are not actually connected to it because of travelling. You couldn't hope to get a smooth running thing out of this size. I think mainly that's about all there is to say on it. The inside of the cab, I'm afraid there's a bit of architect's license on my part, there's a few bits and pieces put in there. But there is one interesting thing which several people have said, and they've said, oh, you've got 4 seats in there. Why 4? And they did carry a crew of 4. And apparently what they were was the driver and the fireman, as we know them on British Rail. And then there was a person who was the kind of, for the want of a better word, like an inspector, who was responsible for the overall operation of the train. And the 4th man, because this was a specialised locomotive just on the one track, the 4th man was an absolute whiz kid. He knew every nut and bolt on the engine. So that if anything happened at anywhere along the track, he simply had a look at it and could say, yes, we can repair it, or yes, we want this, or we want that. So he was really the ace boy who made sure that the locomotives kept chugging on all the time. Because apparently they did, in their short life, they did have quite a short life, but they all amassed quite a mileage. They all did 1 million miles on average, which over a 75-mile track is not bad going. And that really, gentlemen, is about all I have to say.
Are there many of the real things still in existence?
There are 7 of them, and they're all in museums. They are, I believe, trying to get one of them worthy again, but whether they will get it back on track or not, I don't know. But the Americans are getting a little steam orientated again, and they are now tending to go back to steam. But to tell the weight of them, I know that there's one of them, and I forget where it is, whether it's the ground there or what, but they have to move it every 2 years because it's sinking into the ground, and have to bolster the track up and put it back on again.
Is that the one in Florida where Keith Cameron is?
I don't know where it is, Ernie, but there is one. Anyway, there I've switched on just to prove that it isn't just a fiddle, it does actually work. And,
Just one point, Bob. The chappie that came up to you was John Rollins, and he's a member of the club.
Is he? No,
Yeah.
he's a very nice chap.
Yeah.
We finished up as the friends. In fact, he came back to Henley again the next day and said, gee, I just had to come back and have another one.
He lives just down the road from Keith Cameron, 40 miles.
And he came over from the States and he arrived at London somewhere and somehow managed to talk British Rail into letting him ride in the front end of, was it the 125?
That's right,
Just
yeah.
like that.
Yeah, that's splendid.
Anyway, there you are, gentlemen. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.